Hello, my name is John Sheridan. I'm one of the volunteers at the Wandle Industrial Museum. I'm going to describe an illustrated walk along the course of the River Wandle from Earlsfield to the Thames, focusing on the industrial heritage and the water-powered mills that were once here. 4 mill sites on the route are believed to be referenced in the Domesday Book dated 1086. I'll illustrate the walk with some images from the Wandle Industrial Museum archive, as well as a few maps and Google Street View screenshots. So we start at Earlsfield Station, originally built in 1884. The entrance shown here, and behind it the lobby, were rebuilt in 2012. Turning right out of the station, we look at Garratt Lane, and we can see the railway bridge. The London and South Western Railway was built in 1838. There was no demand for a station here at that time because the area was not developed. The bridge was replaced when the station was built and the railway widened in 1884. The original railway bridge also spanned the Surrey Iron Railway, which I'll call the SIR, as well as Garratt Lane. And this is the emblem of the SIR. It was opened between 1803 and 1846, and it more or less followed the course of the Wandle from the Thames to Croydon. It was incorporated by an Act of Parliament of 1801. It was a horse-drawn railway on iron rails. A horse could pull a much greater load on the SIR than carts could carry on Garratt Lane, which was unpaved in the early 1800s. The SIR transported raw materials and finished goods between the mills and the Thames, and the route included spurs to some of the mills, whose proprietors were SIR shareholders. The emblem evokes allegorical figures which could be a sign of the confidence of the shareholders in what they would have seen as an age of improvement. I'll say more about the SIR later when we reach its wharf near the Thames. So going up Garratt Lane, we reach Penwith Road here, and we turn left. And after a short distance, we come to Penwith Bridge. This is from the view from the left-hand side, looking upstream, and just out of sight in the distance were the Garratt Mills. The Garratt Mills made gunpowder in the 17th century for the Anglo-Dutch Wars by milling sulphur, saltpeter and charcoal. Later, these mills made linseed oil by milling flax seeds imported from France. Linseed oil was used in paints, varnishes and in leather working, and a byproduct was oil cakes made of pressed seed husks and oil residue, and sold as food for farm animals. The mill became a bone mill in the late 19th century. Bone dust was mixed with sulfuric acid to make superphosphate of lime, a fertilizer. The mill was badly damaged by fire in 1890 and was reported to have been dismantled by 1919. But the last occupants, Wickens and Pease Limited, remained in business in other premises in the area until well into the 20th century. Here is an older photograph of this same view. This time the railway bridge is visible in the distance. There it is with a train on it. The central barrier here is a mid-20th century construction, which was presumably to equalize the flow of water and reduce turbulence and erosion on the bends. There have been occasional floods and flood warnings in recent years from surface water after heavy rain. Much of the water is in fact recycled water from the Beddington sewage works. This is the route to the bank of the Wandle from Penwith Bridge, which is just here. So we can see the river snaking through the photograph. So we carry on Penwith Road We turn right onto Duntshill Road just before another bridge over the Wandle. We turn left onto Strathfield Road, then right, and then right again to end up on the west bank of the Wandle there. And this is the final right turning that we take down here to reach the riverbank. So this is the Duntshill Mill site. We are just about here, and in 1841 the mill buildings were present. There is a meandering loop which we can see of the river through the meadow, and that was the only channel until early in the 19th century, when the straight northbound new cut was made to speed up the flow. The flat meadow land was a textile bleaching ground in those days, and the mill here was known to have been a calico printing works between around 1780 and the 1830s. I'll say a little bit about the calico printing process. It starts with a plain woven cotton textile, unfinished and undyed. It's bleached by washing it in a wood ash solution where the active ingredient is potassium hydroxide, and that is followed by exposure to water and sunlight over a number of weeks in the meadowland, which contains parallel water channels, and workers known as whitsters periodically doused the cloth with water. The calico was then printed with coloured patterns, and the early process used wood blocks and dyes. Wood block printing originated in East Asia in antiquity. The wood was prepared with relief mirror images of the desired pattern. It was inked and brought into a firm, even contact with the cloth. Multiple blocks could be used, inked with different colours. Vegetable dyes were used from ground Brazil wood and the madder plant, both of which produced red shades, and woad and indigo produced shades of blue. There are also insect-based dyes from the kermes or scale insect and the cochineal, which both produced shades of red. The dyeing processes varied, but typically involved milling or grinding the raw material, boiling it in water, and applying it to the cloth with an alum solution to act as a mordant to fix the dye, and then washing out excess dye. It's fair to say that my description does not do justice to the skills involved in the process. During the 18th century, engraved copper plates were introduced. Then copper cylinders were introduced, but wooden blocks continued in use alongside the newer techniques, and indeed wooden blocks were still in use at Merton Abbey Works until the 1950s. There were a number of innovators in calico printing in the Wandle Valley. One of the first was Peter Movillian, a Huguenot who opened a mill in the 1690s, and then there was Francis Nixon, John Leach, and William Kilburn. Patterns and finish varied according to use. Calico was popular for bed covers, quilts, draperies, and clothing, and also chintz was a glazed calico with a floral pattern. Water power was used in the process in a few ways. For example, to turn calendar rollers for smoothing the cloth, to turn dye mixing paddles, and to turn rinsing spools for washing off excess dye from the cloth in the river. I'll also say a little bit about the history of the calico printing industry. Textile bleaching and dyeing was underway in the Wandle Valley from the 1600s, and also printed calico and chintz were imported from India by the East India Company, particularly after the restoration of King Charles II in 1660. Further to lobbying by the woolen industry, the Calico Act 1700 prohibited importation of dyed or printed calicos, so that was an incentive for the development of a domestic industry. But smuggling of printed calico prompted further legislation in 1721 to ban the sale and wearing of many forms of cotton, and exceptions included fustian, which was made in England of imported raw cotton wool and linen. The importation of raw cotton was not prohibited, and the Lancashire cotton mills lobbied for the removal of restrictions on the sale of cotton, and they were repealed in 1774. So that was clearly a boost to textile production on the Wandle, which seems to have developed anyway despite the restrictions. It's also interesting to note the impact of British protectionism on the development of the domestic industry and the reduction of the role of Indian calico printers. Another later view, 20 years later, of the same area. This is Stanford's map, and it's interesting that the site is described here as a printing and starch factory. The printing was, of course, textile printing. Starch was probably made by milling grain in a way that removed the protein and fibre, leaving only the carbohydrate component of the flour, that is the starch. And wet milling was a method that facilitated starch manufacture together with appropriate sifting and sieving. Flour, ordinary flour, was made by dry milling. Starch powder was used in cooking and laundering and in paper making. It also becomes an adhesive gum when added to hot water. So such a gum could have been used in textile printing to stick the carefully positioned textile to a table when block printing took place. The excess dye and the gum would then have been washed off in the river using water-powered rinsing spools. An example of a rinsing spool survives at the Merton Abbey Works in Collier's Wood, which, as the Liberty Works, was the last commercial textile printing works on the Wandle. So this is an aerial photo of the New Cut route. So we are here. The Sawmills, that refers to a former use of a converted 19th century building. Other former uses of the Duntshill Mill site included manufacture of parchment and colour dye and flock, and indeed there is a flock mill place nearby. Flock making was a form of recycling to make stuffing for furniture and so on. Rags were washed and passed through a breaker, which was a toothed drum revolving at 700 revolutions per minute. The resulting soft wool-like material was then passed through a carding machine and baled for sale. We take the path northwards, northbound on the west bank of the New Cut. A footbridge crosses the Wandle just here, and it goes to the Henry Prince estate, which has a distinctive grid pattern with large arches set into the blocks. It opened in 1938, and its present claim to fame is that Sadiq Khan was brought up there. Between the 1830s and 1929, a so-called cat's meat and chemical manure factory occupied much of the site of the Henry Prince estate. It was a slaughterhouse for what were known unsentimentally as worn-out horses. One of the products was horsehide covers for horse-drawn carriages. It's possible that they also sent bone to Garratt mills for milling. Anyway, we don't take the footbridge to the Henry Prince estate. Instead, we turn left and then right into Foster's Way. And there's a plaque here to Edward Foster, who won the Victoria Cross in World War I. He was a Wandsworth dustman, and he was promoted on return from the war to inspector of dust carts, a post he held for the rest of his career. We continue on the west bank, and in the distance on the left is Southfields Academy. We continue until we reach Kimber Road, and we cross Kimber Road. There was a calico works here from around 1740 to 1812, but no trace of it now remains. We continue on the west bank, there on the other side of the road. That parkland just to the north of Kimber Road was occupied by a prefab housing estate in the post-war years. We reach the site of Adkins Mill, named after a medieval miller. And to get our bearings, this is Garratt Lane on the right with rows of houses, and this is the River Wandle on the left, the other vertical line. At that time, 1841, the mill here on plot 414 was Thomas Creswick's paper mill, and he advertised himself as playing card maker for royalty. South of the paper mill had been a calico printing works from the 1740s to the 1830s, run by the Plank factory, and the meadow here had been a bleaching ground since at least 1657, and a scarlet dye works before it became a calico printing works. The map here indicates weirs and sluice gates to channel the water under, and it goes under there and comes out in plot 414, and around the mill in a bypass channel, and in that way the amount of water going through the water wheel, which was under the mill, was controlled. The calico works closed in the 1830s, and a candle and refining oil factory was set up there in its place, and that closed, and it was incorporated into the expanded paper mill in 1854. So this is a later map, 20 years later, of the expanded paper mill. Stanford's map again. The paper mill was now run by the Murray brothers, who had acquired it in 1854 and had also expanded that year into the premises of the now closed candle and refining oil factory. They named their works the Royal Paper Mills. The Old Sergeant public house is marked on Garratt Lane, and that is still there. The double dotted line here is a footpath, which is still there and which the walk follows. This is a photograph of the Royal Paper Mills in the late 19th century, and this is the Ordnance Survey map of the Royal Paper Mills at around the same time, when it was at its zenith, really the largest state of its development. At the bottom of the map here is Wandle House, which was occupied by James McMurray, and it was demolished in 1928. The filters and settlers here were to purify the river water before it entered the mill. Nowadays, commercial buildings occupy pretty well exactly the same area as those filters and settlers, and we walk around them to the left, this following the left-hand side of the slide. The original paper-making process used rags cut up by hand and then torn and macerated by water-powered revolving machines with blades, then boiled and bleached, and the resulting watery pulp was lifted onto fine wire meshes and pressed and dried. The McMurrays introduced the use of esparto grass in the 1860s for papermaking, imported from family estates in Spain and North Africa. The esparto was beaten, boiled in caustic soda, turned to pulp in washers and breakers, bleached with chemicals, beaten and broken again until it was a milky liquid, which was fed from vats into machines which made paper in rolls 5 to 8 miles long. The McMurrays made different types of paper, including newsprint for the Times newspaper. They expanded the business, raising capital from the city to invest in new machinery, steam engines and buildings. And there is an esparto street nearby. Unfortunately, a fire destroyed most of the works in 1903, and the firm failed to get on foot again. The next occupants of the northern part of the site were Benham and Sons, manufacturers of cooking ranges and also military ordnance during the 2 World Wars. They vacated in the 1980s. And a factory making gas mantles opened on the southern part of the site. That was Falk Veritas, and they lasted until 1972. They were one of 4 gas mantle factories in Wandsworth at various times. Earlier mills on this site included a fulling mill in the 14th century. Fulling was a process to clean and thicken woolen cloth, possibly using water-powered pestles to stamp cloth which had been mixed with fuller's earth, which was obtainable in Surrey to absorb greasy material. It was a corn mill from 1589, a copper mill from the 1660s. A water wheel would have driven hammers which beat and shaped copper sheets, and craftsmen would make pots, pans, brewing vessels and other utensils. From 1777 or thereabouts, it was an iron mill run by James Henkel and members of the Day family, and their products included cannons and shot, possibly for the Battle of Trafalgar, among other uses. Cannon had to be made very accurately and without cracks or distortion, otherwise they might have exploded when fired, and they were cast in solid form, and the barrel of the cannon was bored out with a boring mill, a large rotating iron bar with a cutting head, supported on bearings, powered by a water wheel, moving axially into the cannon along a rack as it cut out the barrel. And an 18th century visitor was very impressed by the furnaces in the mill, the melting of the iron and the power of the tilt hammers, and observed that the men mingled themselves with the fire like salamanders, and the proprietor told him that some of them found it necessary to rehydrate with 8 or 10 pints of porter per day. This would have been good business for the old Sergeant pub next door, on which the proprietor of the mill held a lease at the time. There's an Iron Mill Road and an Iron Mill Place nearby. We join the footpath going to the right, this one here, at a polished granite water fountain, and this path crosses a footbridge over the bypass channel just here, and goes round the left-hand side of the northern part of the mill site and joins Garratt Lane. The path emerges on Garratt Lane from these trees. I just mentioned that the level of the water falls quite rapidly in the bypass channel around the mill site, and this would have mirrored the fall under the mill as the water passed through the water wheel. The channel upstream of the mill would have been engineered to produce this effect and to increase the water power generated by the water wheel. The mill site is now occupied, the northern part of it at least, by the big yellow storage facility here. This is the Old Sergeant, which could be reached by heading southwards down Garratt Lane. However, we head north, not south, and a short walk on Garratt Lane alongside the Wandle takes us to Mapleton Road. The view here is downstream. The Wandle is culverted in the distance under the Wandsworth Southside Shopping Centre, which was completed in 1973 as the Arndale Centre and was the largest in Europe at that time. Small promontory just about here was the site of a dye works, and this was Thomas Williamson's dye works in the 18th century. It was operated by him and his descendants from the 1730s to the 1830s, and they were scarlet dyers. And indeed there had been scarlet dyeing here since 1654. The Huguenots brought secret skills when they came to this country as refugees from France in the 17th century, including scarlet dyeing and felt making using the fur of beavers, hares and rabbits. And these skills were combined in the manufacture of high quality galero hats for Roman Catholic cardinals. Between 1245 and 1965, new cardinals were given a scarlet galero, which was a wide-brimmed, tasselled felt hat with a silk lining. Ordinary priests sometimes wore black ones. When cardinals died, their galeros were suspended over their tombs until they crumbled to dust as a symbol of the passing of earthly glory. It was said that the best galeros were made by Huguenots working on the Wandle, which was ironic given that the Huguenots were persecuted for their Protestant religion. Subsequent uses of this site from the 1830s were a lucifer match factory run by Richard Bell and his descendants, and the manufacture of paints and inks and coloured cement by Cementone Limited until the 1960s. And it then became offices. So we continue on Mapleton Road to reach one of the formal entrances to King George's Park. The park was rapidly renamed from Southfields Park when George V opened it at short notice in 1923. There was a greyhound racing stadium holding 20,000 spectators here between 1933 and 1966. And there's also a storm relief aqueduct crossing the park from the 1880s to the 1960s, and also an open-air Lido from 1938 to 1993 on the site of the present recreation centre on the south side of Mapleton Road. We head north along Neville Gill Close, which is this route here, which runs alongside the shopping centre and some tower blocks. Neville Gill Close was the site of another 19th century new cut for the Wandle. The park is to the left. The new cut enabled some small meandering streams in the meadow here to be filled in. The park was once a textile bleaching ground. The best known calico printer here was Henry Gardiner, who was active between 1774 and 1815. At its peak, his business occupied a large part of the present park for bleaching grounds, and he employed 250 staff. He was known for his commemorative printed handkerchiefs and home furnishings for the American market, and some of his designs celebrated American independence. If you Google Henry Gardiner calico printer, you can see some of his designs online, including an example on the website of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. There is a memorial to Gardiner in All Saints Church in Wandsworth High Street. This is Downe Lodge, which was built by Henry Gardiner. It overlooked his bleaching ground, and we might think it enabled him to keep tabs on his employees. This is the upper mills. The earliest specific record of a corn mill here was in 1521. The shopping centre now covers the site of the upper mills. Building A here was rebuilt with brick in 1818 by Daniel Watney of the brewing family. It was unfortunately destroyed by fire in 1928. And this is a late 19th century clearly posed photograph of Building A and the mill yard. This is the other upper mill building, Building B. The weatherboard construction was more typical of mill buildings on the Wandle. The water wheel would have been under the building, and the water for the water wheel would have entered under the arch there. Typically in mills, the main gearing was on the ground floor, and power from the water wheel was transmitted through a revolving vertical shaft up through the building. The millstones would have been on the first floor, and grain hoppers on the floor above, and other general storage on the floor above that. Flour fell from the millstones down a chute to the ground floor for bagging. This is the same building in 1957, when it was no longer in use as a mill. It was demolished in 1962. The last occupants were a firm of cabinet makers. Corn milling at the upper mills and on the Wandle as a whole ceased shortly after the fire at the other building in 1928. Modern roller mills would have rendered this building uneconomic and obsolete. This is the tithe map, 1841, showing this area of the upper mill at the bottom of the map. And the middle mill is also visible top right of the map, both of them straddling the Wandle, and we can see that the upper mill comprised the two buildings, each straddling branches of the Wandle. Plot 436 was the site of Henry Gardiner's works. Plot 437, we can see if we look carefully, it was a reservoir created early in the 19th century after Gardiner retired. We can see the meadow here in this sort of bottom left quadrant of the map. Comprises a network of narrow channels, and indeed plot 436 was an island. There's clearly a lot of surface water at that time which suited use as a bleaching ground. Over the last 150 years, both the water table and the amount of water in the Wandle have gone down considerably due to abstraction of the water for domestic and industrial purposes. We can also see on this map the Young's Ram Brewery site on the right hand side, and All Saints Church here on Wandsworth High Street. So this is the same sort of area about 50 years on, and again we see the upper mills and the middle mill with the Wandle linking them, and we see weirs and sluice gates to channel the water as well. The reservoir is there still, and also the northern tip of an ornamental lake that is still there now. We can see the channel that is now Neville Gill Close between the lake and the reservoir, and it turns and passes under Buckhold Road and joins the main channel of the Wandle. The Neville Gill Close channel was filled in the late 1960s as part of the redevelopment that saw the demolition of the Greyhound Racing Stadium and the construction of the shopping centre. Buckhold Road has changed course. It now stays on the left of the Wandle and joins Wandsworth High Street just west of the High Street Bridge over the Wandle. So it sort of goes down here like this. On the walk, we turn right at the end of Neville Gill Close into Buckhold Road and make our way to the High Street. We cross the High Street at the crossing close to the bridge over the Wandle. So that is here. This slide, again from an Ordnance Survey map, focuses on the Ram brewery site. Breweries are known to have been here since the mid-16th century, originally as a cottage industry attached to the Ram Inn, which is the PH sign there. Young and Bainbridge, later Young and Co., acquired the brewery and 80 pubs from the widow of George Tritton in 1831. The brewery site expanded northwards during the 19th century, taking over land and buildings, including, in 1838, a former dye works on Ram Street, which would have been around here. Barchard Street nearby is named after one of the families that ran the dye works, and they were a notable local family, being shareholders in the Surrey Iron Railway, as well as the Wandsworth Gas Company. There were fires at the brewery in 1832 and 1882, but each time it was rebuilt on a larger scale. The output was 40,000 barrels a year in the 1830s. At that time, the main product was porter, a kind of stout. Pale ales were introduced in the 1860s, and modern bitters developed from that. Water for brewing came from an artesian well until the 1930s. Wandle water was only used for cooling purposes. It was circulated through coils in the fermentation vessels to cool the temperature of the fermentation. The Young's Ram trademark was registered in 1893. Young's vacated the site in 2006 when their brewing operation merged with the Wells Company brewery. The site has been redeveloped as the Ram Quarter. The external walls of many of the old buildings have been retained. The 140-foot tall chimney, built in 1908, has also been retained. It was reinforced with iron rings when cracks developed in the brickwork shortly after construction. Sambrook's brewers now occupy part of the site, and commercial brewing has resumed. They're opening a heritage centre where the displays will include 2 beam engines made by Wentworth and Sons, which were installed in the brewery in 1835 and 1867. couple of other points about this slide. Compared with the 1890s map, a tramway has appeared on Ram Street. This was in fact an electric tram. There would already have been a tram present, but horse-drawn. The tramway continued all the way down Garratt Lane. Second point is that the middle mill is not now shaded, so that's this empty box here, and that would have been the cartographer's way of telling us that the mill was by then out of use, having closed in 1898. We can see that its weir and sluices were still there. This is the Brewery Yard, a post photo from the 19th century. After crossing Wandsworth High Street, we don't enter the Ram Quarter or cross the river, but we turn left and walk along Wandsworth High Street to All Saints Church, shown here. The church is Grade 2 listed, and there's been a church on the site since the 13th century. Parts of the present building were built around 1630, but it was mostly rebuilt in 1780 and altered in the 19th century. The church is at the junction with Wandsworth Plain, and we turn right and walk down Wandsworth Plain towards Armoury Way, where there is a pedestrian crossing. The presence of this crossing here is our main reason for taking this route rather than walking through the Ram Quarter. I'd suggest exploring the Ram Quarter after the walk. There's an interesting terrace dating from 1723 on Wandsworth Plain. This is the middle mill, which was set back a little from the right-hand side of Wandsworth Plain and was close to the junction with Armoury Way. The earliest record of a mill here was in 1504, and it was known as a Brazil mill, grinding Brazil wood for dye, until 1605. And from 1605 to 1898 it was a corn mill. The windmill supplemented the water mill from around 1750 until the mill was rebuilt around 1770. This Ordnance Survey map shows the middle and lower mills. There's the lower mill and the middle mill at the bottom. And we can see 3 channels of water on this map. The right-hand vertical channel here was the canal built for the Surrey Iron Railway wharf, and it extended to the back of the Ram site on this little cut here. The left channel is Bell Lane Creek here, and the centre channel is the Wandle, which links the lower and the middle mills. And there's the lower mills, mill pond. The 2 PH signs just north of the middle mill, there were the Crane and the Bell public houses. The Bell has been demolished and its site is now covered by Armoury Way. So we reached, crossing the Armoury Way, we reached the Crane pub, which was built in 1738, and it's said to be haunted. It was called the Armoury when this picture was taken, and indeed it was known for a while by that name, but it was originally the Crane and is now the Crane again. A plaque on the wall, can't quite see it from here, but it's somewhere around here, describes some of its history. It's a possibility for post-walk refreshments. The walk follows the causeway, which is the left turn just on the far side of the pub, and just before the Armoury Way bridge over the Wandle. The causeway runs alongside the Wandle and was formerly home to various industries and workshops, including a bolting cloth factory making special fabrics for sifting and sieving flour. The walk also passes under the railway viaduct. This is the Windsor line, which opened in 1846. It branched off from the London and South Western Railway at Clapham Junction. The viaduct is 1,100 feet long and has 22 arches. This is the lower mill near the mouth of the Wandle, as is that one from a different angle, both charcoal sketches. A plaque now marks the site of the mill, and there's a bridge there, from which the mouth of the Wandle and the Thames are visible. There's also a natural feature known as the Spit, which is worth exploring. The lower mill was a partly tidal mill, first recorded in 1371 and probably in use before then. It was in continuous use until demolition in 1898. It produced mainly corn, with a period of linseed oil production in the 18th century. It was rebuilt many times, including at least twice after fires. In the 19th century, it had 12 pairs of millstones, 4 foot in diameter, driven by 3 water wheels equal to 60 horsepower. So this is an Ordnance Survey map showing the lower mill, the bottom centre, and the mouth of the Wandle. There were also waterworks here and gasworks. This was the gasworks, which were on the site from 1834 to 1971, the year in which natural gas replaced coal gas. The coal from which the gas was made came from Newcastle on coastal collier ships, and 3 successive colliers were named the SS Wandle between 1909 and 1959. And the first of these survived an encounter with a U-boat in World War I. Young's was one of the first buildings in Wandsworth to be supplied with gas lighting from the gasworks in 1835. Electricity was installed in Young's Brewery in 1896. And this is a much older map from the mid-18th century, which shows the lower here, the middle here, and the upper mills, all on the same map and all straddling the river. All 3 were owned by the Watney brewing family for a period in the 19th century, and then by the Aerated Brett Company, and then by George Pym and Company, who made a product called the Wando loaf. We can also see a place that they call Wandsworth Island, where corn was grown, and the delta, if you like, of the Wandle. To the left-hand side would have been osier beds for the cultivation of willow for baskets and fish traps. And here is Stanford's map of a similar view, clearer because the waterways are in colour. And you can see a good view of the Surrey Industrial Railway canal with its lock gate, and the cut going to the back of the Young's Brewery. Young's used the cut for the delivery of coal and malt, and also for sending barrels and bottles of beer to Young's pubs across the river. The gas company filled in the canal in 1932, so the cut had to go as well. The lower and middle mills are also visible on this map as the middle mill, described as flour mills. We also see a reference to osier beds here, and gas holders. You see gas holders, and the Feathers Inn here, and that is now, that area has been now recently referred to by developers as Feathers Wharf. So here's a photograph of the mouth of the Wandle with the north bank of the Thames in the distance. I think this was possibly taken in the 1980s. Plaques regarding the Surrey Iron Railway and stone sleepers are set in walls. There's examples of the stone railway sleepers. They're set into walls of buildings in the Ram Quarter. The sleepers were square so that the horses pulling the wagons could walk on the gravel between them. And this is a painting of the SIR wharf, and we can see on it tracks, wagons, cranes. The wharf was the bank of the short canal that had been dug to the east of the mouth of the Wandle. It was used to load and unload the raw materials and finished products between the SIR wagons and Thames barges. The SIR was one of the first railways in the world, coming into operation in 1803, as I mentioned before, and it ran between the mouth of the Wandle and Croydon. The original shareholders included Richard Bush of the Lower Mill, George Tritton of the Ram Brewery, and Florence Young, whose son Charles later took over the brewery. A second line was added to the SIR in 1805, extending the route to the Merstham chalk and limestone quarries. There had originally been a more ambitious plan to build a railway between Portsmouth and the Thames to transport naval ordnance for the war with France, but that line was not built and was no longer seen as necessary after the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. The SIR more or less followed the course of the Wandle, Garratt Lane, Collier's Wood, Mitcham, Croydon. It was built by Benjamin Outram, from whose name the word tram is derived, and the present tram route between Mitcham and Croydon follows part of the route of the SIR. The SIR was superseded by the development of steam power, and also probably by improvement in the condition of Garratt Lane. Garratt Lane became a toll road with turnpikes around 1800, and that enabled the cost of road maintenance to be shared by the parish and travellers who were passing through. So at first, maintenance would have comprised smoothing out ruts and replenishing the surface with materials such as straw, stones and rubble, and repairing drainage ditches and watering the road in the summer to reduce dust. Later, from the 1820s, John Loudon Macadam's method of macadamisation was gradually introduced to the national road system. Roads were surfaced with a layer of small angular stones which became compacted with use and would have allowed heavy carts to travel much more easily than the earlier earth and rubble roads. The SIR went into decline and closed in 1846. In truth, it had never been a success. The volume of traffic and therefore revenues were too low. The rails were made of cast iron rather than wrought iron. They broke too frequently, and repairs used up the profits. Later in the 19th century, James McMurray of the Royal Paper Mills owned the wharf and used it to land esparto, grass and coal from the Thames for his mill. Later the canal was owned by the gasworks, which used it to take delivery of coal before it acquired a Thames frontage in 1906. And after that, after 1906, the colliers delivered coal directly to pontoons in the Thames using steam cranes and into the gasworks. As mentioned before, the canal was filled in 1932 and Armoury Way was built shortly afterwards. So a few final points. The watermill sites in Battersea and Wandsworth, believed to have been referenced in the Domesday Book, are the Lower, Middle, Upper and Adkins Mill sites. The Domesday Book didn't give precise locations, but the Wandle was the only suitable river in the area for mills, and these are the oldest ones. The sites are very unlikely to have changed. The Wandle was well adapted for mills, as being a chalk stream with a rapid fall. It was not navigable and has never been known to have been frozen, and it was the most heavily worked river in London in the 18th and 19th centuries. A wide variety of products were made in the mills, corn milling originally, of course, and then gunpowder, paper, copper, utensils, iron, textiles, linseed oil and more. The Wandle became polluted and attracted the attention of conservationists from the 19th century. Water power was superseded by steam and electricity, and also the old processes were superseded. So roller mills superseded millstones, chemical bleaching replaced bleaching grounds, and synthetic dyes replaced vegetable dyes. There were many business failures and also a lot of innovation and adaptation to changing circumstances and changes of products and rebuildings of mills over time. Some of the successful buildings were family dynasties passing on skills and business contacts and moving and expanding with the times. Some successful millers were able to buy the freeholds of their sites, eliminating rent taking. If you do this walk, I suggest retracing your steps from the mouth of the Wandle to look around the redeveloped Ram site. Finally, I hope this has been of some interest and might stimulate some further research, and thank you for watching and listening.